Chinese factories are shutting down at a rate we haven't seen since the pandemic. Factory owners are selling equipment, laying off workers, and some are even abandoning operations entirely, all because of a single policy change that's rippling through the global economy. The US just raised tariffs on Chinese goods to 145%, and that might sound like just a number, but it's actually creating an economic collapse in China that could completely reshape where everything you buy comes from, and this might be the end of China's manufacturing empire. Have you ever wondered what happens when a factory employing thousands of workers suddenly can't sell what it produces? Well, the reality in China right now is far worse than most people imagine. You see, Chinese manufacturers are facing what many industry insiders are describing as an economic tsunami, one that's proving even more devastating than the pandemic shutdowns that shocked the country in 2020. And what makes this situation truly alarming is how dramatically it differs from previous manufacturing downturns. You see, during the pandemic, factory owners could at least see light at the end of the tunnel because they knew that once the restrictions were lifted, orders would likely return. But today, they're staring into an abyss of uncertainty with no clear path forward. And the stark truth is that many Chinese businesses will face bankruptcy, leading ultimately to widespread layoffs and downsizing across the entire manufacturing sector. And the manufacturing collapse is creating entire ghost towns across once bustling industrial zones. And a viral TikTok video from Foshan recently revealed newly constructed factory districts that were completely abandoned. These were buildings erected just a year ago, now sitting empty with no people or vehicles in sight. And the property owners who invested millions in these developments are desperately searching for new tenants in a market where demand has basically evaporated. And what's particularly brutal about this situation is how the economics of manufacturing make these factories extraordinarily vulnerable, because most operate on razor-thin profit margins of just 5 to 15% per order. And this business model worked when orders flowed consistently, but it's catastrophically fragile when disruption hit. You see, factory owners typically front the money for materials and production costs, either from their savings or through their bank loans, with the expectation that completed orders will cover these expenses plus a small profit. However, when buyers cancel orders, which is happening at unprecedented rates, it's essentially a death sentence for these businesses. Imagine investing your life savings to produce goods worth millions of dollars only to have the buyer walk away, leaving you with warehouses full of unsellable merchandise and crushing debt. The truth is that's the nightmare scenario playing out across China's manufacturing sector right now, and the human cost is staggering. You see, workers are arriving at factories to find padlocked gates and no explanation. Some factory owners facing financial ruin and unable to pay wages have simply disappeared overnight, leaving employees without any recourse. These aren't just statistics, these are actual families suddenly without an income in a country with limited social safety nets. And perhaps most concerning is how this crisis is spreading beyond export-focused factories, because the manufacturing ecosystem in China is deeply interconnected. When export factories fail, they stop ordering from domestic suppliers of raw materials, components, as well as services, and so transportation companies are seeing fewer shipments, and local restaurants that fed factory workers see customers disappear as well. And this economic damage continues to multiply through countless small businesses that depend on the manufacturing sector's stability. And this isn't just a temporary blip or normal market correction, it's a fundamental restructuring. The equipment fire sales tell the story, because right now factory owners are selling advanced machinery for pennies on the dollar, signaling that they don't expect operations to resume. You see, when a manufacturer sells off production equipment at a massive loss, they're not planning to restart when conditions improve, they're permanently exiting the business. And these desperate sales are creating a downward spiral in manufacturing capacity, because as more factory owners liquidate equipment at fire sale prices, the value of manufacturing assets plummets further, pushing more businesses underwater and triggering more liquidations. You see, it's a vicious cycle that's dismantling decades of manufacturing infrastructure at alarming speed. So how does this compare to what China experienced during the pandemic? Well, during COVID, factories temporarily closed, but their physical production capacity remained intact, ready to restart whenever restrictions were lifted. However, what we're witnessing now is the permanent dismantling of that capacity. You see, equipment that took decades to build up is being sold off, scrapped, or abandoned. Workers are dispersing to find new jobs, and supply chains that took years to develop are completely disintegrating. And the structural nature of this collapse raises profound questions about China's economic future, because unlike temporary shutdowns, rebuilding lost manufacturing capacity actually takes years and requires capital that many Chinese businesses no longer have access to. And even more concerning for China's economic planners is many orders aren't simply paused, they're being permanently redirected to emerging manufacturing hubs in Vietnam, India, Mexico, and beyond. And we'll talk about this redirection shortly, but if you're enjoying this content so far, please hit that like button for the algorithm and consider consider subscribing to the channel if you found this content helpful. Now, this redirection of global manufacturing isn't random chance. You see, it's a direct result of a calculated economic chess move, because what happens when a country that built its entire economic model on being the world's factory suddenly finds itself being cut off from its biggest customer? China is now facing this existential question, as nearly 30% of its exports that once flowed to American shores are now having to find new homes. You see, the economic miracle that propelled China to global power status wasn't built on innovation or consumer spending. It was built on making things for other countries, particularly the United States. And this export dependency created an enormous vulnerability that's now being deliberately exploited. You see, American tariffs aren't just another trade tool, they're strategic weapons designed to fundamentally reshape global commerce by severing the reliance on Chinese manufacturing. And when these tariffs make Chinese products significantly more expensive in American stores, businesses don't simply absorb the cost, they look elsewhere. And this is exactly what we're seeing play out in real time as companies scramble to establish new supply chains in Vietnam, India, Mexico, and beyond. And the speed of this transition has caught even seasoned economists by surprise. And what makes this situation particularly devastating for Chinese manufacturers is the double bind they now face, because on one hand, they can't compete internationally because tariffs have effectively priced them out of their largest market, but on the other hand, they simply can't pivot to selling domestically because China's internal market is already flooded with excess production, and this creates an impossible situation where factories have nowhere to sell their goods at profitable rates. And the domestic market saturation presents an especially treacherous landscape. You see, without the relief valve of American consumption, Chinese factories are forced into brutal competition with each other. And this leads to price wars where companies slash margins just to survive another month, creating a race to the bottom that few can survive long term. And this isn't just speculation. We're seeing concrete evidence of this manufacturing exodus in real-world business decisions. If you take Foxconn, for example, this Chinese manufacturing giant recently began assembling iPhone 16 handsets in Brazil, which is a clear signal that even China's most successful manufacturers are hedging their bets by establishing production capacity elsewhere. And Foxconn isn't alone. You see, across industries from textiles to electronics to furniture, companies are quietly moving production beyond China's borders. And what's particularly concerning for China's economic future is how their manufacturing strategy left them vulnerable to precisely this kind of disruption. For decades, China succeeded by making enormous quantities of products designed elsewhere. They excelled at mass production but struggled to develop the innovation ecosystem needed to create high-margin products that could weather trade barriers. And unfortunately, this focus on volume over innovation means Chinese factories often compete primarily on price rather than unique capabilities or proprietary technology. And when tariffs artificially inflate those prices, they lose their primary competitive advantage overnight. Because without patents, unique designs, or specialized capabilities to fall back on, many manufacturers find themselves without a compelling reason for international buyers to stick with them despite higher costs. So what real options do Chinese businesses have when they suddenly can't export to the United States? The brutal reality is not many. Some are attempting to route products through third countries to avoid tariffs, but this brings legal risks and additional costs, while others are desperately trying to move up market into higher value products, but this transition requires expertise, technology, and capital that many simply don't have. The majority are now forced into an oversaturated domestic market, which we discussed earlier, and this creates a downward spiral as more export-oriented factories turn toward domestic sales. Because competition intensifies, prices fall, and profit margins that were already thin become essentially non-existent. And the weakest competitors fall first, but even stronger players can't sustain operations indefinitely in this type of environment. And what we're witnessing right now may well be the beginning of the end of China's 3-decade reign as the manufacturing center of the world. And this isn't a temporary downturn, but rather a systematic dismantling of China's manufacturing advantage. You see, the billions invested in infrastructure, the specialized manufacturing ecosystems, and the economies of scale that made the expression "made in China" ubiquitous are gradually being replicated elsewhere. And for Chinese factory owners, the options are stark. Dramatically pivot to new products or markets requiring capital they likely don't have, relocate production to countries not subject to the same tariffs, which means surrendering their Chinese manufacturing base, or prepare for bankruptcy as orders continue to disappear. The bankruptcy of Chinese factories is just the visible symptom of a much deeper crisis unfolding behind closed doors. Tax revenues are plummeting despite official claims of GDP growth, workers are resorting to extreme measures to recover unpaid wages, and now Korean media has captured something the CCP never wanted the world to see: their officials sneaking into the US Treasury building for negotiations they publicly insist aren't even happening. And have you ever ever wondered why a government obsessed with maintaining face would risk sending high-ranking officials to secretly meet with American counterparts? The answer reveals the growing desperation that exists within Chinese leadership circles as economic reality collides with political theater. You see, these officials, identified by their G20 finance minister and central bank governor meeting badges, though their faces were carefully blurred in the released images, represent a dramatic shift in China's approach to the trade war. The Chinese Communist Party has cultivated a carefully constructed narrative for domestic consumption. State media relentlessly hammers home messages of economic strength and resilience, portraying America as the true victim of the trade tensions. And Chinese citizens are told their economy remains robust and that party leadership stands firm against the foreign pressure. And this messaging serves a critical purpose, maintaining social stability by projecting confidence. Unfortunately, though, this public posturing stands in stark contrast to the private scrambling that is happening behind closed doors, because when directly questioned about these Treasury Department meetings, the Chinese Foreign Ministry flatly denied any negotiations were taking place with the United States, and this flat denial, now contradicted by photographic evidence, exposes the widening gap that exists between China's public stance and its private actions. And for the CCP, this contradiction represents an extraordinary gamble. Party leadership understands that appearing to negotiate from a position of weakness could undermine domestic confidence in their economic management, because the entire legitimacy of the Communist Party rule in China rests on the promise of prosperity and stability, which are both now increasingly threatened by manufacturing collapse. And what's particularly telling is the economic data discrepancy that likely triggered these secret talks. While official GDP figures continue to show growth, tax revenues tell a completely different story. And this disconnect suggests significant manipulation of economic statistics, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of strength while reality grows increasingly dire. When a government's public numbers don't match its private actions, you're witnessing a regime in crisis management mode. And the social implications of this manufacturing collapse have become the CCP's primary concern. Workers who once represented the backbone of China's economic miracle now find themselves without paychecks, often without warning. And their increasingly extreme measures to recover unpaid wages, from public protests to more desperate actions, threaten the social stability that forms a cornerstone of Communist Party control. Unlike democratic systems where economic hardship leads to electoral consequences, the CCP faces a different calculation. Economic pain translates directly into potential social unrest, which could challenge the party's authority in unpredictable ways. And this explains why they've adopted this two-track approach: fierce public rhetoric alongside quiet diplomatic outreach. And the mere existence of these Treasury Department meetings signals something profound about the effectiveness of the tariff strategy. Because after years of dismissing American trade concerns and slow-walking previous agreements, Chinese officials are now actively seeking resolution channels they previously avoided. And this represents exactly what American trade negotiators have sought: leverage to bring China back to the table under terms more favorable to US interests. And what's likely happening in these closed-door sessions? Well, almost certainly Chinese officials are exploring potential compromises on long-standing American complaints about forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, as well as market access restrictions. And the private nature of these talks allows Chinese negotiators to explore concessions without publicly appearing to capitulate to American demands. And the timing isn't coincidental either. As factory closures accelerate and workers grow increasingly restless, CCP leadership recognizes that economic reality is forcing their hand. You see, the tariffs have succeeded in creating precisely the pressure point needed to drive a recalculation of China's negotiating position. What once seemed like a sustainable trade standoff has transformed into an urgent economic crisis requiring immediate attention. And for the Communist Party, this situation presents an excruciating dilemma. Every day, the manufacturing collapse continues, social stability grows more precarious, yet publicly acknowledging the need for compromise undermines years of nationalist rhetoric about standing firm against foreign pressure. And their solution is secret negotiations paired with continued tough public posturing reflects that they are in an impossible position. So where does this all leave us? We're witnessing nothing short of a global manufacturing restructuring that's permanently altering the economic landscape. China's 3-decade reign as the world's factory floor is coming to an end, and not with a dramatic crash, but through a strategic dismantling orchestrated by US trade policy. For investors, this shift creates clear winners and clear losers. Companies with supply chains deeply entrenched in China face serious disruptions, while businesses positioning themselves in Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Brazil stand to capitalize enormously on this transition. The truth is, this economic transformation is inevitable, and the only question that matters now is how fast this transition happens and whether your portfolio is positioned on the right side of history. We hope hope you found this content enjoyable, and if you did, please hit the like button for the algorithm and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, and we will catch you on the next episode.